incident response, malware triage. So even as a red, currently focusing more on the red team side, I really enjoy leaning in and helping uplift detections and collaborating with blue teamers, especially since I have that background. A personal area of interest of mine is macOS post-exploitation. So that's usually where I spend my free time, where if I'm not playing a Zelda Breath of the Wild with my kids, I'm doing that. I will caveat and say that I am trash at Zelda Breath of the Wild. I pretty much have to ask my kids and they tell me where to go and I just go and it works. But when I'm not doing Breath of the Wild, I'm usually working on some side project around macOS post-exploitation. I enjoy 80s and 90s nostalgia, so I'll have little pictures throughout the presentation reflecting that. And I am on Twitter with the handle @Owens. I also want to shout out Chris Ross, also goes by Zorier at Spectre Ops. I consider him to be what I call like the forefather of macOS security research. Well, both Chris Ross and Patrick Wardle. And so I just wanted to shout both of them out and just thank them for the groundwork that they have laid and how they have opened the door for people like myself to come behind them years later and build and innovate on the work that they've done. So just kind of looking at the agenda of what I plan to go through, I plan to briefly talk about what I call the State of the Union for macOS, look at some common deployments and attack opportunities associated with those deployments. Then I also plan to look at the attack, the kill chain from the attacker's perspective and what that looks like in the macOS environment. Also, I plan to discuss adversary emulations, simulations, along with some challenges and opportunities unique to macOS. And then I plan to close out with defensive recommendations. So from a State of the Union perspective, if you look at the world outside of the little sliver of the San Francisco Bay Area, you'll notice that in most of those environments, the vast majority of desktop operating systems are Windows with very small percentage of Windows, of Mac OS. So you can see stats here at the bottom that kind of reflects the world outside of the Bay, where you're probably around 80% Windows and just under 20% Mac OS. However, if you look at the tech companies specific to the Bay Area, those numbers actually flip, where it's very, very common where you may see Mac OS makes 80 to 90% of endpoints, with Windows only being 10. And so that part has been an interesting facet for me, and kind of what drove me into digging and spending more time on the Mac OS side. And from an endpoint detection and response over the years, I noticed when EDR initially came out years ago, it was mostly Windows support with very little Linux or Mac. And then over time, Linux and Mac started to become supported. Initially, those were really just kind of like raw logs with no intelligence or analysis around it. But if you fast forward to today, EDR, even for Mac OS, has come a long way and even has some decent detections out of the box. Some of them are even pulling threat intelligence data sources. So there's definitely room for opportunity, but I definitely wanted to mention as well the progress that I personally have seen with EDR products as they relate to Mac. And of course, you also have more malware that's targeting Mac endpoints. And you can look at Patrick Wardle's Mac Malware of 2019 report. It's a great example of looking at examples of real world instances where Macs are being targeted and what that looks like. So given what the world looks like outside of the Bay, there's still a lot of discomfort with targeting Mac OS. There's a lot of questions on both the red and blue side. Some of the offensive questions include like, what payloads should I use? How do you build those payloads? What languages do I need to learn? How do you get access to a Mac? Then once you get access, what do you do? Is there any relationship to Active Directory? Endpoint detection and security products, what should I be worried about? And so for this talk, I plan to cover as much as I can. I won't be able to go as deep as I want because I'm trying to cover a large array of topics, but I hope to answer as many of these as possible during the presentation. Before I jump in, just wanted to share my perspective on what I consider to be some goals of red team operations. So you can see a picture there of jiu-jitsu. I'm actually a white belt in jiu-jitsu. And so this picture resonated with me. And I think about kind of the relationship that guys like Tim Malcolm Vetter and others in the red team space and how they've compared cybersecurity, blue versus red, to jiu-jitsu. And I think it's a very great analogy because as a student in jiu-jitsu, I was often taught moves and I was taught both how to execute the moves and how to defend the moves. And you have to know both to really be successful. And I think that really ties over well into like red blue operations, where red teams really need to understand defenses and detections and the artifacts you're leaving on the system. And I think blue teams really need to understand offense and what those capabilities are, what the attacker mindset are. It's like the two are kind of merging and through challenging and working together with each other's skill sets. So some of the specific goals I think about for red team ops, I think about the goal of testing detections, right? You want to make sure the efficacy of detections is high quality. You also want to look at testing your response, and not just the ability to respond, but how adequately can the response lead to remediation. Also thinking about testing preventions that have been put in place and making sure those are working as expected. One question I like to answer personally is, if an adversary with these types of capabilities went after our organization, how would we fare? How far would the adversary get? How long could they stay in the environment before blue team sees them? How long would it take blue team to completely eradicate them? Things like that. I think that gives a lot of good contextual perspective to the operation. And then, as I mentioned before, I really enjoy collaboration with blue to actually uplift detection. So instead of just throwing a report over with detection recommendations, I actually enjoy getting in, digging into Splunk or EDR consoles, and just actually working side by side to build and validate detections. So let's look at some common deployments in macOS environments. So I do want to reference one source that I thought was really good. I think you should read on it if you're interested in the space. But Luke Roberts and Calum Hall, they did a talk at Objective by the Sea where they talked about JAMF from an attacker's perspective. Definitely check that out. I just pulled a few points from their presentation around common management methods that I personally have seen in my experience. So the first group is what I would call one-offs. So those are environments where you'll find macOS hosts, but they're not managed by the IT department. So there may be some engineers or developers who are allowed to purchase Macs through the company for different reasons, but those Macs are not managed by the IT organization. So then you have a second group that's more custom, and those are your very mature, large, well-funded organizations like your Apples, Facebooks, Googles. Those organizations will have a large presence of Macs, but they'll have custom infrastructure, like their own LDAP infrastructure. They may have their own custom mobile device management, which is like tied to the LDAP and is used to manage the Mac endpoints. So again, very well resourced, but given the amount of funding and bodies you need, that's usually not the most common method you see. The most common I typically tend to see is the third group there, which is managed with commercial tools. The specific commercial tools I'm most familiar with is JAMF Pro, but I've also been reading about Kanji that's up and coming. So that's one I'm going to keep an eye on. But JAMF Pro is very common, and they even purchased Patrick Wardle's company, which I think is amazing because Patrick Wardle's company has been doing a lot of bleeding edge research. So it's going to be really cool to see how JAMF Pro brings in the security aspect over time. So common JAMF deployments, you have your JAMF admin server, you have, and that's pretty much where the admins that run the JAMF infrastructure can configure policies, apps, packages, that will in turn manage the JAMF agents, which is your Mac endpoint. And each endpoint will have an agent. It communicates with the server. And then, of course, on the managed endpoint, you also have self-service, which is where users can install packages or apps that IT has already vetted. So it's a really neat infrastructure. Again, this is at a 10,000-foot view. There's definitely some other components, but I just want to show you some of the main pieces for JAMF infrastructure. And so, as I mentioned, you can see how the Mac endpoints are managed by the JAMF server with policies, packages, scripts. And then what's also common is the JAMF server will have Active Directory binding often on the back end, which will allow like synchronization with passwords. What often also happens with Active Directory is the groups that basically the access to the JAMF server is often controlled by an AD group, such as like JAMF admins or Casper admins. And so what's interesting is you think about some of the reasons why people often cite moving from Windows to Mac, which is to reduce the threat surface. But when you tie in Active Directory on the back end, a lot of those same threats are kind of, or attack vectors are pretty much reintroduced into your environment. It's just that now the front end, like the front door might be a little different. Like there's probably a higher chance you'll land on a Mac and you'll have to navigate that. But once you do so, you still will then have access to Active Directory, and a lot of those attacks will still apply. Another aspect for JAMF that's interesting is the remote management aspect. So in some environments, remote management might be set up by the JAMF admin for things like screen sharing on the managed endpoints. And if that's set up, then there's often an admin account that has SSH access to those managed endpoints. For those specific purposes. And so one thing I always think about is if remote management is enabled, is there a static password being used? So that brings back very similar to like local admin password management on a Windows side where LAPS is used to randomize that password. So you can't just get one password and use it on every endpoint. That same thing would apply here, where if you're just using a static password for remote management, that password gets compromised and you can now access any organization managed Mac that has SSH exposed. Also, the JAMF API is very interesting. And again, access is often controlled by the JAMF AD group. So it's usually like JAMF admins or Casper admins, whatever the name of that group is. And as you can see here, by default, in most environments or a lot of environments, you'll see it listening on 8443, and then you can hit like JSS resource accounts to list out accounts or computers, policies. One interesting thing too is you can also, once you are enumerating on a specific computer, you can actually check for remote management, as you can see here in the red box, and you can see if remote management is set to true, and if it is, you can see the account name and it's the SHA-256 hash string. And so if you check like multiple computers and you're seeing that same SHA-256 hash string and account name, then there's a good chance that there is a static password being used on every endpoint. So next, I'm going to jump into some common points of interest from a red team perspective in modern IT environments. So of course, one is going to be the CI/CD pipeline, just because it's such a consistent way to deploy code and images in an environment, and it's so common, and it's built on trust relationships and dependencies across various components. So using this very basic example, like a developer commits code, which triggers a Jenkins build to create and push an image, which eventually gets rolled out into Kubernetes. So if you look at this flow, let's say the Kubernetes pods and nodes and containers are all configured well by best practice, like system anonymous access for the nodes is not set up. There's no vulnerabilities, no attack paths that I could leverage to compromise there. However, let's say we look upstream and let's say Jenkins is misconfigured, right? It's on a vulnerable host, or it's set up without authentication, or even if we go further upstream and compromise the developer's laptop, and we get access and we find a Jenkins key or other tokens or SSH keys, things like that that are on their machine that we can leverage, then we can follow the flow of the CI/CD pipeline and still get access to those containers. So even though we can't directly attack them, we can kind of walk upstream and find misconfigurations and still get access to the CI/CD pipeline. What's so interesting about that too is depends on the environment, but that CI/CD pipeline could also carry you from one environment over to the other. So if you're in corp, you could possibly ride it into prod. You know, it all depends on the environment and best practices and what's being done, but it's a very interesting attack point. Another one is secrets. Secrets, I think, are just, as a red teamer, I enjoy secrets because they're pretty hard to detect, and there's not a lot of analytics and a lot of environments around abuse of secrets. And so you've got secrets in a lot of different places. Like you have HashiCorp Vault, which is what I consider to be the standard in a lot of tech companies now for application secrets management. And so you may find an environment where they have HashiCorp Vault, but they took the image from HashiCorp, modified it, or they put it on a vulnerable server that introduces attack paths where you can leverage that as an attacker, get access to application secrets. You also have your endpoints, and of course, especially for engineers and developers, it's very likely you're going to find SSH keys or AWS secret and access key, GCP credentials, Azure creds, and And the good thing from an attacker's perspective with those is that they're often going to be stored clear text with no protection on them. And so you can just easily pivot to those, grab those, and start moving to other hosts. You also have your GitHub, where, of course, code secrets can be committed to code. Of course, Kubernetes, where if you happen to land in a managed container, it's a good chance that that container, like you may land in, is root, because a lot of packages are installed that way to make it easy. And once you have root, you could then possibly find a master secret and leverage that elsewhere. So long story short, there's a lot of different places that secrets can be stored, and those are definitely things that red teamers come after. Good old file shares. So into today's day and age, I'd say most commonly files are probably stored in the cloud. So like Google Drive or Enterprise Dropbox or Box. But there's still lots of environments where legacy file shares still exist. And they're still there for legacy reasons, or they're one-off reasons where people don't want to put that stuff in the cloud, and so they stand up a file share. And so this attack path still becomes very relevant from an attacker's perspective, where you can sweep for port 445, find every host that's listening, and then once you find a host that's listening, you start to enumerate what shares can you see, either unauthenticated or via credentials that you have. And there's all sorts of stuff that you can find there. You may find like scripts with credentials built in. You may find sensitive PII or financial data. Just a lot of sensitive data that can be of use during a red team operation. So this is an area that I definitely recommend that blue teams proactively search for, find, and remediate like long before an assessment happens. And then, of course, you have Active Directory, which, going back to the earlier slide about how JAMF, a lot of JAMF environments have AD bindings, and that introduces your Active Directory attacks. So just kind of walking through the common attack path, which is you find a misconfigured AD join server. So it could be Jenkins, as an example, without a password set, or with a remote code execution vulnerability, or also your Tomcat. But going back to Jenkins, once you compromise Jenkins, you could get on and find a Jenkins SSH key. And even though that's not the master Jenkins, you may find a Jenkins SSH key that's used for master Jenkins on like other test hosts in the environment. So that can present an attack path. You've got Tomcat, which is also stood up oftentimes with default credentials, which will allow an attacker to upload a WAR file with a web shell, get access, dump credentials. Same thing for Workzoo, which is a Python server, which a lot of times is stood up with in debug mode, which will allow you to run Python code on the console page itself and get access to the host. And there's several other examples, just wanted to call those out. But once you have access, you then kind of move into the RECON, where you can actually run Bloodhound. And what's cool is Fox IT released a Python collector for Bloodhound. So now you can run the Bloodhound collector from Mac or Linux, as opposed to needing PowerShell or to be able to run SharpHound. Then, of course, you have your password sprays. So in Mac environments and Linux environments, like it'd be SSH, like you could spray the username and password, username and SSH key. You could also spray against Active Directory. Once you have a set of credentials, any authenticated user can dump a list of current AD users, and then you can try a single password against every user, such as summer 2020, and see which accounts you get access to. Alternatively, you could also spray against Windows servers. So basically checking SMB with a set of credentials and seeing what hosts SMB will give me access to. So there's a lot of tools like CrackMap exec that can do those kinds of things. And then it kind of brings you to the last part of it, where you have your domain compromise, where you find a privileged set of credentials cached. You dump those credentials, and then you start your impersonation, where you do pass the hash, pass the ticket, pass the cache, etc. Eventually, like, you get domain admin creds, and then you move to your forged tickets, like your golden and silver ticket, which then moves you to the next step, where you basically dump all employee passwords or hashes and start cracking them, looking for clear text credentials. And then that brings you to the last box there of pivoting. So usually in macOS environments, like, compromising Active Directory is not going to be the end goal. Usually it's just a step that you may need. Let's say you need a certain account in order to pivot to another environment in order for you to accomplish your objectives. And so that's usually your main reason for coming after AD. It's usually not to say, all right, I've compromised AD, exercise is done. Usually it's more like we needed AD as step B in order to get to C, D, and E in our operation. Another aspect I wanted to point out in modern IT environments in the Bay is the concept of different environments. So I'll quickly walk through like common setup. You have your corporate environment, and that's where your users live. That's where you have your Mac, your Windows endpoints, your Chromebooks, and a lot of the services that employees interact with, such as you'll have Okta there, Salesforce, Active Directory, various IT application servers, Confluence, Jira, all of those kind of things live in a corporate environment. And then you have your dev environment, and that definitely looks different per organization. Like you may have one company, a dev environment might just be a dedicated like subnet, and like you may or may not have a separate set of credentials to get to that subnet. Whereas in another environment, you may need a complete separate set of credentials, and maybe you need to jump like a jump host in order to get to dev. So it kind of depends on what the environment is. And then, of course, you have your production environment where a lot of your microservices and your backend services are. Oftentimes, you'll find customer data stored here, and you'll find various things here, like be mostly Linux, but you may have a tiny share of Windows there. You may have some RabbitMQ and Kubernetes and AWS GCP. So you have all those environments, and then you have your jump hosts in the middle where like a typical path would be a certain limited number of employees will have access to jump hosts in order to get to the production environment to do their jobs. And then, so from a red team perspective, you start to think about like what the stated controls are versus what the reality of those controls really are. So one example is you think like, well, are there any direct connections from our corporate environment into production? Like it says we're supposed to the policy is only go through jump hosts, but are there exceptions? You also think about how the jump hosts are configured. And you start to think, well, are there any exceptions to how those hosts are configured? Maybe you've got 3 jump hosts that have 2FA enabled and a separate set of credentials, and then maybe there's a 4th one that doesn't have 2FA on it, which presents an easier attack path. So you kind of question that, you definitely assess that, or even around your dev environment. Are there any relationships between dev and prod? So if you happen to compromise like a CI/CD pipeline or like a Jenkins host and dev, will that SSH key or will those tokens work over in prod? Are there shared credentials between the 2 environments? So these are things that from a red team perspective that we're constantly thinking about as well. Is like we know what the stated controls are, but what's the reality of the relationship and flow between the different environments? Also, just wanted to point out some common low-hanging fruit that red teamers enjoy abusing. One is APIs, and APIs are everywhere now, especially with cloud services. And a couple examples with Docker. So Carnal Ownage, Chris Gates did a really good write-up on how Docker can be misconfigured to allow anonymous API execution on containers. And if so, you'll be able to navigate to this host on port 2375 or 2376. And if you can list out the containers, then there's other commands that you can likely run in order to like execute shell commands and even read secrets unauthenticated. Same for Kubernetes nodes, where if system anonymous access for the API is enabled, then you'll be able to hit port 10250 or 10251. And if you can hit that port and see running pods, then you can also like make a certain curl request externally in order to basically do exec API commands and get shell access. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon to find that once you get access to a container, you're running as root, just because of ease of use with how a lot of things are packaged. And so then that presents other opportunities where you can take secrets and like pivot to other hosts. Of course, you've got cloud APIs or just APIs in general. One thing that's interesting that I've done in the past is if I have a service that uses an API and it's a commercial tool, I'll read the developer documentation and they'll have a sample key there. And I think, well, let me just try it, see if it works. And there's been instances where that sample key actually works. So There's definitely a lot of opportunity around APIs. Even if you have some custom backend APIs, you could totally kind of probe them, see what kind of data you can get back. If there's a number at the end of the API, seeing if you could use something like burp intruder and increment on that number, see what kind of data you get back. But you have other areas of low-hanging fruit like default credentials or stuff with no authentication like VNC, servers with browsable content, whereas you're doing directory brute forcing, you may find script with credentials or even unpatched or unmonitored systems. So next, I'm going to just quickly look at some initial common initial access vectors that are used. The first example is just your typical external payload fish and pivot. So you send an email with a payload attached. So it could be like a .app package or a macro-enabled document for macOS, and the user detonates it, and then you have post-exploitation access to their Mac host. One thing you could do is, if JAMF is enabled, you could check to see if the JAMF binary, or in order to check to see if JAMF is there, you could check to see if the JAMF binary is present. And if it is present, you can do things like check JSS connection, which will basically return the URL of the JAMF server, the JAMF admin server, which may come in handy later when you get the credentials to access it. JAMF version, you can list users from JAMF as well. You can also do your other host recon, typical things that you'll want to do, like what endpoint detection and response or antivirus products are running. Are there any secrets on the host? That type of information. You could also prompt the user for credentials with like a fake Apple-looking prompt, tunneling to other hosts, password sprays, your typical post-exploitation that you'll basically rinse and repeat over and over until you accomplish your objectives. So that's one example. Another example is external credential harvest fish. I personally think this is a very interesting example given the state of things today and how a lot of stuff is federated or cloud-based. But in this example, I'm just showing an example using EvilJinx 2, which was written by Kuba Gretzky. It does what's called 2FA man-in-the-middle phishing, where it presents a fake page that looks like your actual target login page, and as the user interacts and logs into this fake page, it basically proxies their login to the actual API authentication backend points. So basically proxies your login, including the 2FA process. And so using this methodology here, you could actually, even with 2FA enabled, as long as it's not U2F, like if it's just a simple push to your phone, this process still works where using EvilJinx 2, let's say you were targeting Office 365 or Okta, you can get access remotely to someone's Okta, and then you'd have access to things like email access, which you could then use for internal phishing. And internal phishing has a much higher success rate than external phishing because it's actually coming from an employee's account and it bypasses certain controls that external phishing emails go through. Of course, potentially file access. So if VPN is not required for things like Google Apps or Google Drive files, then if it's not required to access that and you're in, then you'll have access to those files, and you may end up finding very sensitive things, maybe data that should be in production that's actually there in their Google Drive or Dropbox or Box folders. And you have access to other services like Slack, Salesforce. And so what's interesting about this attack path is you could actually, as a red teamer, accomplish your mission objectives without ever landing a payload on a Mac host. And I think this is a very interesting attack path that I think blue teams should check out. Like, what does that look like in our environment if someone has, if the same Okta token is being used from multiple places, like especially over a short period of time? What does that look like? Do we have detections for that? Do we have the ability to revoke those tokens? Things like that. Another example that's really interesting is being able to test your externally facing business units. And so just about every company has some kind of externally facing business unit, like it could be inbound sales or customer support, some part of your organization that interfaces with the public in order to like start an intake for some kind of process. So like in this example, let's say you're dealing with like an inbound, or I guess a sales organization that takes calls. You could actually, from a red team perspective, inject into that process and see, like as an attacker, if they were to leverage that process, how far could they get? What are our controls? Do we have visibility? Do we have uh, adequate response procedures for that? So in this example, like you could call in and like purport to be some business, kind of social engineer your way in, talk to the rep, build rapport, get their contact information. Once you hang up, like follow up with a benign email, and then follow up after that with an actual email with your payload. And then you get initial access like to the host, and then you kind of what I mentioned earlier, your post exploitation. So what's interesting about this attack path is sometimes, like especially if it's a support team that you're doing this for, and they're externally facing, their mail may sit like the mail actually, if it's in Zendesk as an example, may get monitored differently than your corporate email, and so there may be looser controls there that may not um, that basically where your corporate environment, those controls may not necessarily apply to this environment. So it's a good way to kind of test your visibility and your response here, and also kind of uplift the people involved with that process since they're externally facing, just to help with that security awareness and make sure everybody knows what the procedures are in the event of an incident. And then, of course, you have your assumed breach model, where you have like payload execution by a trusted agent. So it could be an employee that you have a relationship with in the company who's agreed to basically run your payload. And maybe they've run it on a separate Mac that doesn't, where they're not doing business work. And they execute your payload, and then you kind of go down your typical attack path. You could also do like assumed physical access, where maybe you come in with a rogue device, plug it in, and then have that rogue device tunnel out to like DigitalOcean, and then you tunnel into DigitalOcean in order to access the device. So there's a lot of different ways you could do that, but assumed breach model may also allow you to test things like other aspects, like people who leave their computers unlocked, being able to walk by and pop in Bash Bunny or something on their machine. So definitely it's a very interesting test path here. So in a nutshell, there's a lot of similarities to Windows environments, really, except for the initial how, since it's Mac versus Windows. Again, you really don't need domain admin to meet your operational objectives. In most instances, I probably say you don't need it unless like the path that you're going on requires domain admin in order to get an account and pivot. But there's a lot of different paths you could take, and really depends on what your objectives are. So now I'm going to do a more detailed look on the attack side of what the different phases are. So starting with RECON, here are some useful RECON sources that I personally enjoy using. The first one is internet registries like Aaron, Appnik. For example, you can actually query your company's name and then get AS numbers, and then you query the AS numbers and get IP ranges. And that's a quick way to find out what publicly facing IP ranges your company owns. And then one of my personal favorites is DNS text records, and just doing something as simple as host dash t txt and then your domain. That will basically return your DNS text records. And what you might find, especially in today's time where a lot of companies have authorized certain organizations to send mail on their behalf, when you look at text records, they may show up there in the text records, where you may find something like DocuSign is there, or Zendesk as example. And so what that does for me as an attacker is it gives me insight that, all right, if DocuSign is listed in your text records, that gives me indication that you're using DocuSign. So if I use that as a phishing pretext in one of my campaigns, then I can have at least some assurance that it's going to resonate because the employees there use DocuSign. So it probably would be something that I would use. Shodan is excellent as well, where you can feed in those IP ranges that you got from your internet registries and AS numbers. You can feed all that stuff into Shodan and search. Another thing I like to do with Shodan is I'll also search SSL certificates by the domain name, and that will actually help you find infrastructure that an organization owns, but that's actually cloud hosted instead of on-prem. Of course, you have GitHub, and just about every tech organization now has an organization GitHub page. And then under the organization's GitHub page, they'll often have employees listed. And what's interesting for that is if my objective is to like compromise the build pipeline or access source code, then I could easily go to GitHub, look at the organization and employees there and identify like who the engineers are that I might want to target, who may have certain keys on their machines that I would want to leverage. Of course, you got certificate transparency logs that are also interesting with new SSL certs that are stood up. Like, could also show some test hosts that maybe aren't properly configured that were stood up that you may want to poke around with. Various open source tools like the Harvester that you can dig on domains or even do domain or subdomain enumeration or brute forcing. Trufflehog and tools like that, you could search and point it to GitHub repo and look for secrets that may have been committed. Hunter.io is one of my favorites for getting target email addresses. And really, you just have to create an account, log in, and you search for the domain, and it returns it's basically like a marketing source for basically aggregating various marketing sources for email addresses. So you could use that. Also, you could look for just by using the company's name, .okta.com or .zoom.us or .slack, like in order to see if those technologies are present, and if so, like they may play a part in your social engineering campaign. From a weaponization and delivery perspective, I'm a huge fan of GoFish. I will say, when using GoFish, just make sure you go through the code and you change the static GoFish mail header that's in there. Otherwise, like mature organizations that do flag on that, like you'll get seen and get stopped pretty early in the campaign. So just make sure you do like those types of checks and changes for GoFish. But outside of that, I think it's an awesome tool. And because it has the ability to do pixel tracking, you can do a couple rounds of phishing where you do like a recon fish, where you have some kind of like burnable throwaway email, could be a gift card or something with a link. And as people click that link, you're just collecting user agent information in order to fingerprint like what types of hosts are in the environment. Then you take that data, figure out what those types of hosts are, and then you build your payload, and then you do your follow-on like actual targeted phishing. And as I mentioned earlier, since most environments have 2FA enabled, if you're looking for credential capturing, EvilJinx 2 and CRED Sniper by Mike Felch, those are really, really cool tools that can still be successful as long as it's not U2F. Example payloads. Again, MacFish is a good example of a tool that you can use to generate a macro for Mac, and it even produces your macro where it's like it's an if statement where it's if Mac, then execute this code, else if it's Windows, basically you can have a separate set of macro code there. So really neat. AppFell by Cody Thomas is probably my favorite because it's very flexible with JXA, which we'll talk about later, JavaScript for automation, and it also has payloads like Chrome extensions that Chris Ross Zorier wrote and contributed to that. You have shell scripts. My tool, Mac Shell Swift, does Mako binaries currently. So there's a lot of different options of different payloads that you could select, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. But going back to JXA, so JavaScript for automation was really supposed to be a replacement, so to speak, for AppleScript, because AppleScript can get very convoluted for very complex tasks. And so JavaScript for automation was a way to basically replace or supplement those limitations. And so it was brought to light by Cody Thomas at Spectre Ops a while back around the benefits from an attacker perspective of JXA. And the things I like about JXA is it's hosted, the post-exploitation code itself is hosted on a server, and your app that you're going to run on your target clients basically has very few lines of code, because really all it's doing is evaluating the code, the post-exploitation code on a server, and is running it in memory. And because of that, it passes notarization. And so a while back, I was trying to figure out, like, how can I build an application like a .app package to basically execute JXA without using the OSA script binary? And so that's how I came up with the JXA app concept of doing it all programmatically in order to avoid command line detections and still take advantage of the JXA benefits on the red team side. So around the notarization piece, I have shared that with Apple in the past, and it's possible that they're making changes or will make changes soon. But as of the last time I've tested, this still does pass their notarization check. So here's an example of what a JXA app looks like that I wrote a while back. And this one here, you can see like this is it. It's not a lot, very few lines of code, and you can see the Apple script command there in the first red box, where it's doing an eval statement, and it's evaling the JavaScript file that you would put in at the IP and file parameters there, and it's basically executing that post exploitation code that's on the server side. So as you can see here, even sending it in for notarization, there's really not much for notarization scanners to key in on because everything's on the server side. So looking at command and control, I just quickly wanted to point out a good read from Tim Malcolmvetter around simple, safe red team attack infrastructure. So at a high level, 10,000 foot view, what it's basically saying is you want to be responsible with your red team infrastructure as a red teamer. You not only don't you want blue team to be able to find it, crawl it, pick it apart, but you also don't want to have your stuff, your infrastructure out and exposed where it can get compromised, and then your environment that you're assessing, like that environment gets compromised through your infrastructure. So that would be a terrible scenario. And so he has some real good points there on how to make sure your C2 environment remains protected, and also around how to be flexible with your C2 so that as things get burned on the blue team side, you don't have to completely stand down your infrastructure, stand it back up. Maybe you just replace a redirector and keep moving, right? So really good article, both for blue, I think, and red, in order to kind of understand what that safe and flexible infrastructure looks like. Also around the command and control side of things, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different options. So Jorge Orchias and company have done a good job at the C2 matrix of testing and evaluating different command and controls, including macOS based ones. Some of the ones here, like Empire 3.0, still lives on and is still maintained. You have AppFell, you have Evil OS X, of course you have Metasploit. So lots of different options, and there's lots of different payloads. Like, right, we talked about Office macros and browser extensions, and you have Apple script, Python, and each of those has their own pluses and minuses that you'll want to pick based on your operational needs. For instance, Python has the benefit of currently it's up to this point is still included by default on macOS, even though that's supposed to change in the near future. But Python scripts aren't run through Gatekeeper, so you don't have to deal with the whole signing and notarization. The downside, however, is it's super easy to detect. So each of these has that kind of pro and con to it that you'll pick based on what you're looking to do in the environment, what your operational goals are. And then you have, of course, you have different C2 types. Like you may have your typical beaconing over HTTP or HTTPS DNS, or you just may have a consistent TCP socket to an IP and port where your C2 happens. So it all depends on what you're looking to do for your objectives. Around the post-exploitation side, I just wanted to point out a few things by Zoyer, Chris Ross. He just released on his GitHub site a set of macOS security tools to definitely check out. It's got things like shellcode runners, and here's an example of a keylogger for macOS that works. And what's cool about it is if you're just looking to get common user keystrokes, you don't even need sudo for it. You do need sudo if you're looking to get like protected field values like passwords. But that's something to definitely check out. Also, Malware Unicorn at Facebook did a workshop on dialib injection techniques, kind of what that looks like, what the flow looks like, what an example payload is. So that's something you could do, and it's really a hands-on workshop that you can follow along. So you can check that out. You can also pull data of interest from like a host you have access to. So this is a tool that I wrote called SwiftBelt, and it's written in Swift, so it's native to macOS. And I called it SwiftBelt because I was inspired by Harmjoy at SpectreOps, like his seatbelt tool on the Windows side. And so this is basically an enumerator that uses API calls, does not use any command line utilities, and it can do things like enumerate security tools on a system, look for your bash history, browser history, launch agents, clipboard content, see if Slack is present, and if it is, extract some Slack data. And so you could actually, for your op, have this type of capability automatically execute as soon as you get access. And have it pull back for the operator. So definitely take a look. Blue teams, even check it out and see if there's anything like that. The only thing I saw that would really detect it is the Apple endpoint security framework. which definitely can log like file accesses and reads. So it saw a lot of that activity. But I definitely recommend playing around with it and getting familiar with it. Also, on the post-exploitation side, you can see if OS query is present, and if it's present, you can use it from an attacker perspective. So I also have a blog on this where I was curious about this and played around with it and built the example into Mac Shell Swift, where because I'm a big fan of Facebook's OS query project, and for those that are not familiar, it's a way to ask questions of your remote host. It's cross-platform, and it allows you to ask questions such as like who last logged in, or what running processes are on the system, or what's the bash history, things like that. And so I was curious, like, well, I wonder if an attacker could actually leverage it just by invoking it remotely. So I played around with it and was able to get that going. It does use command line utilities in order to invoke it, so it's detectable that way. However, my personal guess is that most environments probably are not monitoring OS query invocations, so it probably will not go detected, even though it's easily detectable. But my general rule is it's pretty safe in the macOS world. As long as you stay off the command line, you're pretty safe at this stage. In terms of credentials, you could prompt like for credentials using the OSA script binary, which again feeds into command line history, or alternatively, you can call the OSA script or the NS Apple script class, or even the OSA kit class in order to prompt without using the OSA script binary. Around persistence, a lot of techniques out. So Sentinel-1, I'll just reference their blog posts as they step through a lot of the common methods for persistence on macOS. So I won't jump through too many of these because I know a lot of us are familiar with launch agents and launch daemons and cron jobs. Configuration profiles is often, I learned this from Thomas Reed, but a lot of adware is has been up to this point using configuration profiles in order to accomplish their objectives. So one of the aspects of persistence I wanted to point out was folder actions, in a blog by Cody Thomas. That was the first place I'd heard about it, where you can basically pick a folder, and once the user interacts with that folder, you can set it to run an Apple script from disk somewhere. So there's a lot of little caveats and nuances to it, but it's a very interesting persistence technique that I definitely recommend you check out. I won't spend too much time here because we kind of talked about these as well. What lateral movement tends to look like in a macOS environment via CREDs that are stolen or spraying, usernames and keys or passwords. So yeah, we kind of covered this already. So next, I'm going to talk to adversary simulation and emulation. The best example that I've heard is from Tim Malcolmvetter, where he explain adversary emulation as having a very specific threat profile. So it's like based on a threat intelligence report, specific APT actor, and taking their TTPs and emulating them in your environment, basically being that adversary in your environment and seeing how your detections and response hold up. Whereas adversary simulation does not have a specific threat profile, but a more general threat profile of what a capable adversary would likely do, like what types of tactics and TTPs might they run. So I thought that was a really good example. And even though today most threat intel data is on Windows TTPs, I do believe that we can run adversary emulations and simulations for Mac as well. An example for an emulation is I think you can emulate the activity of known macOS malware families like SHLAYER. Even Thomas Reed has done a lot of analysis around some adware campaigns that do some pretty nasty things that you may want to emulate. So those are examples of what you could pull from. You could pull from Patrick Wardle's Mac Malware of 2019 report. And then in terms of simulations, you can take threat intel reports and basically create a Mac OS equivalent as close as possible to simulate that activity. So here's an example with the SHLAYER campaign, and this is actually from June of this year from an Intego report, but users or people were getting infected by Google searching for videos where they would find like a fake flash outdated page, which would download a DMG. It would have like a picture with instructions on it, and basically instructions for them to execute this file that looks like an app. It has an app, like a Flash app image, but it's really a shell script. And then once that script is executed, it drops a zip locally, in the temp directory, and then inside of that zip, there's an app that basically downloads the real flash and downloads follow-on malware. So you can see examples here of what that looks like. So if you were to emulate that exact malware family, this is kind of one way you could do it. You could send an email with a link to a DMG, like entice the user to download the DMG, and include like a picture with instructions, have your shell script masquerading with the flash icon. And I think MD Labs did a really good write-up on like file icon and file extension tricks on macOS. So you could have them execute that shell script masqueraded as Flash, and then have it download a zip locally to the machine, which includes an app package that downloads real Flash, and then maybe you download like some other C2 framework or some other malware. So that's an example you could use to emulate SHLAYER. And then on the simulation side, as I mentioned, since most threat intel reports are Windows-based, what I like to do is just try to figure out how close on the Mac side can we get to it. So on the Windows example might be like Office to CMD to PowerShell. Maybe in Mac you have Office spawn bin sh, which then runs Python. Or like prompting with a fake prompt. On the Windows side, you're using a logon screen API call, but maybe on the Mac side, you use OSA script, basically to do the same thing. Same with password spraying, whereas in Windows environment, you may spray over SMB. Here you'll spray over SSH. So just very rudimentary examples, but that's kind of my mentality when it comes to simulation. Like take these TTPs and do a macOS equivalent as close as possible to those. So next, I'll look at some challenges and opportunities specific to macOS. So here's a really cool chart from Howard Oakley. He writes a lot of cool stuff for macOS from time to time. So here's a link where you can dig in deeper. Also, Phil Stokes at Sentinel-1 did a blog post, and essentially there's three security components for macOS. You have your protect side, which is your signing, your notarization, gatekeeper. You have detect, which is around like YARA rules for certain things, blacklist hashes, other stuff that Apple threat analysts are seeing in the wild. And then you have your remove, which is your malware removal tool application. So it's interesting, you've got those three components. And I will say for the detect side, for XProtect, that tends to be like stuff that they have seen in the wild. So if you're writing your own malware, I've never had any issues personally with XProtect because, again, it's not in the wild. So there's nothing for it to really key in on. So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly about Gatekeeper since I know time is running short. The com.apple.quarantine attribute is appended by the operating system to any file that's downloaded via the browser. And then Gatekeeper checks certain file types for that attribute. And if that attribute is present, it will check to see if that file has been signed with a valid developer ID. And for recent versions of Mac, it will also check to see if that file has been submitted and passed notarization or has like a notarization ticket stapled to it. And if it passes both of those, then it will actually give the user a prompt to say, are you, like, do you want to run it? Or I forgot the exact contents of the message. But so that's kind of in a nutshell how Gatekeeper operates, and it poses challenges for red teams because eventually, like scripting languages that have been exempt from Gatekeeper are eventually going to be removed from macOS, and so you're going to have to basically come with like Objective-C base code or Swift-based tool, which is going to most likely, if you're looking to get a payload on the system, have to go through that process, which is why earlier I thought it was very interesting about targeting SaaS and federated apps where you don't even need to touch Mac endpoints. So around the signing process, here's an example of what it might look like on the red team side, where you create or use an email that you already have, create an Apple ID, use a phone number for two-factor verification or a device, separate device for two-factor authentication. Then you get your Apple developer account that you pay $99 for. So you have two options there when you're paying for that. If you're using like a credit card that's not tied to your username, Apple will take your money. Yes, they will. And still kind of hold your process and ask that you send in like a valid identification like driver's license. The other side of it is you use a bank issue card with your identity, you get it signed, but you run your op, blue team finds it, they analyze it, and then they see your developer ID so they know it's you. So it's kind of a lose-lose scenario here. Another approach is you could register an LLC and use that for your signing, which you could do, but it's a lot of work up front, and you still may hit the same like snafu with it around the identity part if the identities don't match. So it just has got to be real careful with that. But this is another option as well. So again, you have to sign and notarize, and then there's other challenges too, like hardened runtime is required for notarization. Sandboxing app transport security kind of determines once your app is running what it can communicate out to. So there's different layers there that are challenging. So a real quick area around notarization testing. So I did a couple tests, and I just want to share the results with you of those tests. One, I built a red team app that stole CREDs and launched AppFell, submitted it for notarization. It was successfully notarized in 5 minutes, but it was revoked about a week later. So basically I had a week to use it, which was really interesting, and it showed me about the notarization process, about basically how stuff's notarized up front and there's some kind of back-end check after the notarization. Here's an example of the code. So you can see it's clearly a credential stealer, username and password. A second app I wrote this time took out the credential stealing code and just had it execute AppFell. In other words, just a JXA app. This time, submitted for notarization, notarized in minutes, developer account was never revoked. So this is that same screenshot from earlier where there's not much to key in on because all the code, post-exploitation code, is server-side. So again, JXA apps, just wanted to show you an example there. And basically, if you want to build your own like JXA C2 application and not use what AppFell has, you'll need to be strong or pretty good in Objective-C. Because right now, there is a bridge between JavaScript and Objective-C, but a similar bridge with Swift has not yet been established to my knowledge. So some general defensive recommendations as we close out. Some people I wanted to recommend you keep an eye on: Patrick Wardle, Richie Cyrus, Thomas Reed, Sarah Edwards on the defensive side. They're doing a lot of cool work. Definitely check them out. On the offensive side, The Evil Bit, Chris Ross, Cody Thomas, Phil Stokes, check them out. I have a blog that I put up earlier this year on macOS detections, like some base level detections. That I think should be in any macOS environment, so check that out. I also did a test with Apple Endpoint Security Framework, where I ran the tool that I wrote, MacShell Swift, against it and did various post-exploitation tasks just to see what was captured, so you can see that blog there. Also recommend monitoring JAMF AD groups, ensuring you have AD segmentation or segregation, where I'd assume your AD is going to get compromised, but when it does get compromised, you don't want everything else, all the other cards to fall. Also, if not needed, don't enable SSH on every managed Mac by default. If you're using remote management, I recommend randomizing the password, as we talked about earlier, and then separating your keys and tokens between your environments. Also, getting visibility into cloud abuse. So like if certain very powerful cloud permissions are assigned, like make sure you can detect that in your environment. So in summary, EDR is getting better for macOS, but Gatekeeper continues to pose challenges on the red team side, which is good. Swift is easier to learn, but I'd say Objective-C is more beneficial for the time being, especially around the reason for JXA and Objective-C having a bridge with JavaScript, where Swift does not, even though I enjoy the Swift syntax a bit better. Again, targeting federated login services can be even more impactful than targeting Mac endpoints. And you can do emulations and simulations in Mac OS environments, basically just as you can in Windows environments as well. Just have to kind of change it and adopt it. Let's see here. Resources, a bunch of different resources, so check these out when you have time. A lot of different articles, a lot of cool people doing some interesting work in the Mac OS space. So thank you for your time. Again, Omar, I appreciate you and the team giving me the opportunity. And I'll be on Twitter and on Discord for anybody who has questions. Feel free to reach out.